Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Some of you may have attended my candidacy proposal back in January, and so some of this work has transpired since then, where we had a very robust project, and then we are trimming it down. And so one of the aspects that we're looking at is utilizing different triggers, utilizing mobile health to drive persuasive technology. So being that we're talking about mHealth, so if everybody wants to take out their phones, we're going to do a little exercise real quick. So the first thing is we have 3 trigger messages here that if you can, I'm going to give you a second so that you can read these to yourself, and I'll read them out aloud. The first one states that, did you know that there are easy carbohydrate counting tricks? Click on the corn icon to view 45 easy carbohydrate counting tips. So one of the things to think about as you're reading these is these messages are going to a group of type 2 diabetic patients. They are going to receive these messages via their mobile phone, for which it is an interactive mobile application utilizing guide view, where they will be able to click on an icon such as this corn icon, where these 45 carbohydrate counting tips will be available to them. So they're going to receive this message, and then they will be able to take action. And so the second one states that you can consume proteins with your diabetic diet. You can even eat some of your favorite, such as fish, seafood, chicken, poultry, along with cheese and eggs. And then the final one there, so portion control and food size determination can be difficult. Click on the plate icon to read 5 tips for estimating your portion size. Okay? Everybody comfortable with those messages?
Tell them what their task is, Scott.
Yeah, I'm about to tell them. I didn't want to give them a biased piece. So basically, with these messages that you see here, you're going to, number one, do you think that these messages impact your behavior in the same way? And I'll flip back to the messages shortly. And then the second, and I was trying to get poll everywhere to embed into my presentation, but it did not want to work for me, so we're going to go this methodology. And then the second question is, which text do you think would motivate you more? So again, you're actually going to text your answer to 37607. So the number that you're going to text is 37607, and then in the body, you're going to, for question 1, you're going to type in this number or that number, depending on what your response is. Okay. Does anybody need me to go back to the questions, or the messages, I should say? Yeah. Hold on, guys. That's when poll everywhere doesn't want to cooperate into the. All right. So that's the number that you're going to text. Yes, you're going to do 191770. Or no. Okay, and that replies to all 3 of those. So again, so our first question is, do you think that these messages impact your behavior in the same way? And so your yes would be 91770, and then no would be 91775. So again, the number that you're going to be texting, so just like you'd be texting someone, you're going to key in 37607, and then in the body will be these numbers here. So again, if you're going to answer yes to, do you think these messages impact your behavior in the same way? You're going to key in 91770 in the subject line, or no, 91775. Then your second question was, which text do you think motivates you more? And you have the corresponding numbers here. So you would select one of those in a different text. And normally this is easier when I can embed, pull everywhere, but for some reason it didn't want to cooperate yesterday. Is everybody done? Anybody still working on it? All right.
So the keyword Y cannot be found. I wouldn't run an experiment this way.
Normally it works better when it's embedded. It didn't want to let me embed. So we do have some people that figured it out. So do you think these messages impact your behavior in the same way? Most of you are saying no. A couple of you are saying yes. And it should allow us to go to our next question, but it's not working.
Oh, I mistakenly said yes because the message wasn't on.
Okay.
It wasn't on the same screen. I was having enough trouble figuring out what number.
And like I said,
That's why I'm a usability person. It's got to be simple.
well, normally, and we're going to talk about simplicity, and I'm beyond not being simple right now, but
Got you back up and just take back to your full, put it back on your full editor. No?
yeah, it's, for whatever reason, I was having trouble with it this morning and yesterday. So we're going to come back to the second question because I don't want to tie up too much time with that. And so just a show of hands, we'll do it this way, and then I'll pull it up at the end. So how many of you thought text 1 would motivate you more? Show of hands. 1. What about the second message? Okay. And then what about the third message? Okay. All right. So it looks like 1 and 3, and then the bulk of everybody was in 2, which is what we found so far in our very beginning stages of this. There is not consistency across the board. And so we're going to talk a little bit about these. And then we're going to go back into simplicity here in a little bit. So just a little bit of background. We're going to talk real quickly on persuasive tech and mHealth. But so persuasive technology, an interactive computer technology designed to alter people's attitudes or behaviors. This is the impact that we're really looking at here. So persuasive tech can assist in altering people's attitudes or behaviors by leveraging behavior change theories and incorporating these different types of triggers that we're going to talk about. And so when we see a lot of persuasive tech, a lot of times what people are utilizing them for, what you see in the literature, is just simply a trigger as a reminder, okay? And that's what most of us do. How many of you will put a note in your calendar to remind you to do something the next day, call your office line, leave yourself a voice message so that when you get back to the office, you'll remember to do something? That's just the simplest form of a trigger. The key aspect, though, with that is usually a person that is doing those types of things has motivation to accomplish a task, and they also have the ability to accomplish that task. That is why they're leaving themselves a message to do as much, okay? And then triggers are supposed to change behavior, but they're not studied in detail. And again, the reason why we see the lack of that is people consistently study and look at reminders, just a simple push of a message just for someone to remember to do something. So what we started to focus on, and one of the behavior models that we really focused on at the end of my candidacy proposal was the Fogg behavior model. Is anyone familiar with the FBM or the Fogg behavior model? Dr. Cohen? And so basically the crux of the Fogg behavior model, it looks at 3 things. Person must be motivated, they must have the ability to perform a behavior, and then they actually must be triggered to actually perform that very specific behavior. Okay, so we're going to talk about these different triggers that look at motivation and ability. Okay, so different types of triggers to behavior according to Fogg's behavior model. So our first one is a spark. Okay, and that's a trigger that's designed for individuals who lack motivation specifically. Okay, so basically a text or video that inspires hope, and we're going to dive into these a little bit more in detail coming up. A facilitator is the opposite. It's a person who has high motivation, but they actually lack the ability to complete a specific task. So an example there, again, a text or video that shows how easy it is to accomplish something with items on hand. And again, that's very important for these facilitators. You can't try to improve someone's ability to accomplish something if they don't have the means to actually accomplish it. And so one of the things we see a lot when we're talking to this diabetic population is one of the things that we hear all the time about ability, and it comes to exercise. What do you think is their number one issue with exercise?
Motivation.
What's that?
Motivation.
Motivation, that's some of it. they don't have a gym membership. I don't know how many times I've heard that they don't have a gym membership. Well, you can easily exercise without having a gym membership. So the last thing we want to do in this instance is send them something that tells them to go work out on this type of machine or something like that, because it would be pointless. They don't have the means to do that. And so we want to give them methodologies to do that, whether it's picking up a 22 ounce can of cream corn in the pantry and utilizing that to do some exercises or something. And then finally we have a signal, and the easiest way to remember a signal is it's a simple reminder. That's all it is, just a plain reminder. And it's basically designed for individuals who have both ability and motivation. So that instance that I talked about earlier, where we utilize that quite often for ourselves to remember to do things, is typically where we have high motivation and the ability to actually accomplish that task. Okay, so why are trigger designs important? So appropriate and well-designed triggers are vital to designing persuasive technology. And these triggers can target specific behaviors at the right moment. And that is very important. You know, if you're trying to tell someone to take their medication and you're sending them a message at 3 o'clock in the morning, what's the odds of them actually receiving the message and taking their medication? And again, that's a very simple form. Or a reminder message to check their blood glucose. Again, if you're sending it at 2 o'clock in the morning, they're not going to check their blood glucose. So not only is it sending them the correct information, but also the timing is important. Okay? So appropriately designed triggers for population health can further the advancement of M-Health. And so we're really looking at this from a population standpoint. So the population that we're working with is a group of type 2 diabetic individuals. They are actually employed within a hospital system. And so we identified these individuals through medical claims database query and then verified them through a nurse navigator there at the hospital. So we're really looking at this from a population health standpoint. And so our rationale behind this is, in order to increase the effectiveness of M-Health applications, we must determine the impact of the specific tools as it relates to large populations. So again, in our case, a type 2 group of diabetics within an accountable care organization or within a hospital system. It could be within an insurance database, whatever it may be. And then once these differences have been noted, we can then tease apart how best to personalize the M-Health tools. And so what you see a lot in the literature is actually the opposite, where they're trying to individualize everything and tailor everything, but they don't understand the simple concepts and effectiveness as a tool as a whole as it relates to population health. So again, if you're working with 1,000 patients at Memorial Hermann, for instance, how are you going to tailor all these different modalities to these individual patients? Number one, you have to worry about time. Number two, do you have the individuals with the right education to actually do this tailoring for all these different individuals? So again, this is looking at it more from a whole instead of an individual basis. And so the hope is that this strategy allows us to develop an M-Health application that becomes more of a prospective tool for population health instead of a retrospective piece. Okay. So our literature gap and why we're taking a look at this. So triggers, again, have primarily been designed to match an individual's motivation or ability level. So as I started to do the initial research on this, I actually was able to speak with Dr. B.J. Fogg at Stanford. And we basically pitched him the project of what we're doing, and he was very intrigued. Because as they're designing these triggers in their lab at Stanford, a lot of times it is based on knowing an individual's motivation or knowing an individual's ability. So it's very customized to a controlled environment. He's very intrigued at taking a look at it from a population health standpoint, where we can try to understand enough of the spectrum and then dive into the population and see what our effectiveness is going to look like. So again, we have not found any studies that stack triggers against each other within a specific population group. Typically, it is only one of them that's being evaluated, and for the most part, primarily, most of them are, again, the signals. So it's just a primary text message reminder. And so we feel that introducing these triggers to a predefined population can help us understand the effectiveness of triggers at the population level rather than the individual level. Okay, then we can allow for personalization at the individual level once we've understood this effectiveness. Okay, and so why M-Health for delivery of triggers? I mean, we could use stand-up PCs, we could do a few different methodologies, but so number one, due to the widespread dissemination of capabilities of M-Health and the particular transformation where we can embed behavior change theory and persuasive technology is the main reason why we're using M-Health. And because mobile phones really I mean, everyone in here has a mobile phone, and they act as a companion for you. And the biggest thing, I actually read a study last night and states, this just came out, but 99% of all mobile text are opened, and 90% of those are read within the first 3 minutes of being received. So that's a pretty remarkable study when you talk about the visualization. That also applies for MMS messaging as well. And so many of us are utilizing many MMS components, whether it's WhatsApp, whether it's Facebook messaging, whether it's LinkedIn messaging, different components like that. The big thing is that you do receive the same type of alert that someone will receive via a text. So whether it's a ring, a ding, a vibrate, whatever it may be. Okay. So what is the most effective way to persuade? We could sit here all day and talk about that. There are many different models out there of effective ways to persuade. What we've found through our literature research and what we're going to focus on is the combination and building blocks of different theoretical components to persuade and to sustain the persuasion. And so we feel that a combination of behavior change theory and trigger design will be the most effective way to persuade. And so we're using social cognitive theory plus persuasive technology, in particular sparks and facilitators. And so for the focus of what we're going to be talking about today and the focus of my dissertation, we're only using sparks and facilitators. Excuse me, we're not looking at the signals. There's plenty of research on these reminders. So what we really want to do is stack these sparks and facilitators on top of each other in a population setting and see what the effectiveness of these are. Okay. So we're going to walk through these different types of triggers, and then we're going to get into some of the triggers that we've designed and what we've seen thus far. So a spark, again, it's a trigger designed for individuals who lack motivation to perform a very specific behavior. And within the Fogg behavior model, he really looks at 3 different types of instances that helps you design a spark. So number 1 is pleasure or pain. The second one is hope or fear. And the third one is social acceptance and rejection. Okay. So we'll talk briefly about these, and then we're going to get into this some more in depth. So the first one, pleasure, pain, as one would think, is very powerful as a motivator, as you can start to think about pleasure and pain. The one thing is, if you're going to utilize pain, it does have a negative connotation, so you need to understand your population before you deliver those can be perceived as negative type messaging. Usually an immediate motivator in most cases, especially as we're looking at our population. So one of our instances here is, this is a message that would come at the end of the week for these participants. So it's basically telling them, great job, remember to treat yourself after your hard work, and you can have 2 small cookies or 2-inch square brownies. Okay? And so again, it's that pleasure of, I worked hard all week long, and then now on Sunday or Saturday I can have something good to eat. I can have a sweet. So it's the pleasure component of knowing that I did something good, now I can have a treat for myself and feel good about it. Motivator 2, hope and fear, or hope or fear I should say. So the anticipation of something happening, whether it's good or bad. Hope can be a very powerful motivator, especially in healthcare. And that has a double-edged sword. Everybody knows about non-compliance, right? I mean, if we have a patient that's non-compliant, it doesn't matter how much hope we put into them, they're non-compliant. The hope is not helping. So if we do have a population who has more compliance, this is where we can see where hope will have potentially a big impact. In a lot of patients, fear has a large impact. They may have a family that has a history of diabetes. They watch their grandmother and their grandfather, maybe their mom or their dad, start out with their toe being amputated. Then they had a below-the-knee amputation. Then they had above-the-knee amputation. So that could actually be fear for them, knowing that they have diabetes and that they don't want to have that happen to them. So in some cases, with the second motivator, hope and fear both can be utilized in a very constructive way. And so a simple example here is, so you can manage your carbohydrate intakes by finding the proper balance of food so you can feel your best, do things that you enjoy, and lower your risk of diabetic complications. So it's a very simple hope. We're trying to get them to do the things that they need so that they feel that they can manage their diabetes and not have complications. And so the third one is the one that's growing the most. And so that's social acceptance and rejection. And so increasing motivator technique to do social networking behavior. And then people are naturally motivated to avoid being socially rejected. Okay? So I think most people, if you're in any type of social network, I think you tolerate, especially from an anxiety level, you're good with just about everything that's on social media, but anything that puts a negative connotation on what you're doing or what you are as an individual potentially is that social rejection that you're wanting to avoid. You don't want the bad thing. With social networking, you want only good stuff talked about you. In social networks, you don't want the bad. And that's kind of what that's getting at there. And so a very simple example here, and it's very, very simple. Just watch a short video of people like yourself discussing their successful carbohydrate counting tips. So basically, this is just trying to show them that other people like yourself is doing this, you can do it as well. Okay. And then we have Facilitator, which again is designed for individuals who have high motivation but then actually lack the ability to accomplish something. So we want to trigger a behavior while also making the behavior easier to do and accomplish, and that's very important. We cannot tell people to do something if it's not easy for them to do or they don't have the means to go about doing that. And then it tells the individual that a behavior is easier to do and that it won't require a resource he or she does not have at a particular moment. In that particular moment, you can define that moment in different methodologies. So if you're talking about something that you want them to accomplish during the course of the day, the moment becomes the course of the day and not right now. But if you're telling them to do something right now, well, then that moment is then and there. So you want to be careful of how you're wording your triggers and what they have access to and what they don't have access to. Okay? And again, we're not going to focus on signals, but I wanted to talk about it briefly. Again, it's a trigger designed for individuals who have both the ability and motivation to perform a behavior, and it serves as a simple reminder and does not seek to modify or simplify a task. Okay? So basically, it's the complete opposite of what we just talked about with sparks and facilitators. Okay? So one thing that we learned very quickly is not all triggers function in the same way, so it's important to test these trigger designs so that the intended audience interprets your trigger as the way you designed it. So as we just witnessed very, I wouldn't say eloquently because it didn't work very well, but what we noticed was not everybody picked up on the same type of message that would motivate them, okay? And so it's very important that we try to understand these, and we did it fairly quickly, so maybe if you had more time in a controlled environment, maybe you would have answered something differently. But it just shows us very quickly that they don't function in the same way. So poorly designed and tested triggers will be viewed as distracting and interrupting to the recipient. So I talked about earlier, if we send something at 2 o'clock in the morning, so if you enroll into this study that we're doing and I start sending you messages at 2 or 3 in the morning, do you think you're going to keep participating? No, you're going to get tired of it, or you're going to turn the triggers off, and then you're not going to receive them, and there goes the study. So again, poorly designed and tested, as we'll talk a little bit about that going forward. And then utilizing surveys is a quick and effective way to ensure that your trigger design is interpreted exactly how you designed it. And we're going to talk about how we set that up and what we visualized and some of the changes that we made to our triggers. We're now about to send out the third rendition of these triggers that we've designed thus far. And so the name of the mHealth application that we're designing is Capability, and that's the name of it there. And so for my dissertation work, what we're doing is we're integrating social cognitive theory, the Fogg behavior model, persuasive technology, which is our triggers, and into an interactive health communication framework that's already been developed to develop an mHealth application. So specifically, I'm testing the impact of the spark and the facilitator triggers to determine their effectiveness. And so again, we have roughly 100, we have a little over 100 individuals right now. We're going to utilize 99 of them. And so basically what's going to happen is we're going to have 33 in a control group, we're going to have 33 receive sparks, and we're going to have 33 that are going to receive facilitator messages. So these sparks and facilitators were selected due to the gap in the literature that I was talking about earlier. And so I just wanted to, this is some recent articles that just came out, so just wanted to kind of mention some of the gaps that are still out there. Need to assess the relative effectiveness of specific mHealth and text messaging intervention delivery characteristics, the use of these behavior change theories in these interventions, including theories that can address the quality of the SMS messages. And so again, why we feel that that's still out there is because everyone is still just focusing on reminders, whether it's reminders via phone, whether it's reminders within an EHR, whatever it may be. And nobody at this time has really focused on these other types of triggers in this scale. And so that's what we talked about there. No studies have been compared across Fogg's triggers. Therefore, we have never been juxtaposed for these. So none of them have been put together and compared. So in order to build out the materials for the study, I operationalized the definitions and then asked participants to categorize my instances. And so we use faculty members from SBMI, and we also use faculty members from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, and specifically in the College of Nursing and Allied Health Professions, where I currently work. Okay. And so this is a rendition of what they received. So they received an operational definition there, motivate behavior so that users feel ready to take action. We gave them some information about the different types of motivation. We let them know the different types of ways that these sparks can be delivered, and then we gave them an example there, okay, at the bottom. Okay. All right. And so here was the same on the facilitator side, so they received this as well. And again, it gave them an operational definition. It broke it down into how they could receive the messages, and then also provided an example. And so one of the things that we wanted them to make sure that they understood was that we're letting the user know that they already have the product at home to cook with. And again, it was a way for us to ensure that they understood what the operational definition was trying to accomplish. Okay. So our first rendition of testing out these examples is we sent 3 Spark messages and 3 facilitator messages were provided to 8 participants using SurveyMonkey. They all received operational definitions. In addition, they were provided instructions on how to complete the survey. And at the end of each message was a drop-down box where they could only select Spark or Facilitator. Okay. And so here were actually 2 examples that we submitted to them. You can see they're long, potentially not simplistic, which we'll talk about. And so our very first one is a Spark. Very robust, and the language being used, the amount of language, I should say. And so only 3 out of the 8 participants stated that it was a Spark. So not exactly what we were looking for. And then our second one example there is a facilitator. And as you can see, half of our participants answered it correctly. Again, not what we were looking for. So when I designed these, I really thought this was going to be fairly easy, to be honest with you. And I thought I'd roll through this and I'd be on to something new. And 2 months later, I'm still on the triggers. But we think we have it accomplished now. So these are actually the results of what came back from the survey. The 3 different Spark messages and the 3 different facilitator messages. As you can see, everything was kind of all over the place. Nobody got them. We didn't have anybody that, as a whole, got them all correct. So when I compiled the results, I was trying to figure out what was going on. And so what we did was, in addition to collecting the data, I did conduct some interviews trying to figure out why people are not understanding what I wrote. And I worked off of Fogg's behavior model, so I worked with a lot of the information that was used was information coming from the American Diabetic Association. So I really thought I did a good job, and I didn't. But what I learned was, number 1, ambiguous language. People changing responses over time. So what ended up happening was I gave them a paper version during the interview process, and what they answered in the survey was not the same thing they answered when I gave them the paper. Documentation, again, using that paper-based survey, we ended up getting some different responses sometimes. And so what we ended up finding out was basically keep the language as simple as possible, which we were talking about just a while ago with data visualization, and it turns out it's the exact same thing here. So keep it simple, give examples. Don't use any types of words that could build in any type of ambiguity. And so what we did was we conducted our second survey. And so 5 Spark messages and 5 facilitator messages were sent to these 8 people again. Same process that we utilized the first time. Okay. And here's 2 examples of some new trigger design methodologies that we in place. So number 1, when we were trying to do the motivation piece, you can see where we actually capitalized some of the letters, trying to really let them know that this is truly a motivational piece, that you can do something, it's your favorite. We wanted to really make that kind of pop out as something that would be motivational. And we did that with a few of the others, and basically 7 out of 8 people got this one correct. So we had an 88% response rate. And then the second one, again, we're just focusing on that second sentence there. We want to let them know that this is something that you probably have on hand. You have the ability to hopefully cook if you're an adult. If not, well then I don't know what we're going to do in those cases. But we assume that everybody can at least turn the oven on. And this is a recipe that is like 4 ingredients that almost everybody has at home. But so again, 8 out of 8 people got this one right. And here are our second wave of results. And so they did increase. The problem is they're really not where we still need them to be, because if we turn this into a population of 100 at 75%, that means 25% of the people are not interpreting our messages correctly, which is not going to work. So even though we did improve in our messaging strategy and our redesign, really trying to keep things very simple, very concrete, trying to make sure people really connect with the message as a motivator or something that would enhance my ability, we still did not quite get everything that we needed. So we conducted a second round of interviews on top of that. And so we did identify, as you can see, that what we changed from our first process to our second process, we did increase our results, which was good. But we did receive a new finding, which we didn't receive the first time, and that was participants actually did much better at identifying the facility triggers than they did with the spark triggers, okay? We did not have that the first go-round. So really trying to understand what happened this time, and can we mimic what we're doing on the facilitator side back to the spark side, okay? So when we noticed that when we kept the language simple, our scores really improved. And I was giving you an example here of that recipe one that we did. So we need to continue, and we're on our third rendition right now, to continue to refine our triggers, messages, so that it's clear that we're focusing on motivation or ability. And keeping it simple is the key in what we found. And so it's important for us that we can have enough people identify these as a motivator or a spark. When we roll out the intervention, the people who are in the spark group and the people that are in the facilitator group, they're going to have no idea what they're in. So it doesn't matter. But from the background, from our analytic and statistical component, we need to make sure that what the person is interpreting is a motivation or an ability component. And so that's why it's the importance of us getting these things correct. Okay. And so talking a little bit about the new finding there. So participants performed unexpectedly better on those facilitator triggers. So after interviewing some of the participants, it became very evident, and I didn't put it here, but really 3 out of the 4 people I interviewed all stated this. As they were reading the paper, again, I always brought the paper with me, paper copy of the survey when I interviewed them. Every time they would read a spark message, the one thing they kept saying in their head was, is it easier to accomplish and do they have what they need? So it's like the one thing in the operational definition that just stayed in their head every time they read one of those things. And so for some reason, they really identified with that. And every time they would read each message, they would actually say this out loud. Is it easier, and can they do what they have? And so, number one, when you reflect on it, it is easier to understand, interpret, and to write something about someone's ability versus motivation. Because motivation as a whole is so different. What motivates one may not motivate the second. And so what we learned was we cannot make these motivation statements very specific. And it was hard as myself writing them because I was a biased writer. It's hard for me to write about motivation if I believe motivation is a certain way. And so what we've learned is to take the specific out of the statement, make it as generalized as possible, and really just drive home the fact that it's a motivator. And so that's what we're doing now for the third rendition that we're going to be sending. So as with the first survey, I got a little bit ahead of myself there, just kind of telling you what we did. So we walked through with the individuals, we did the interview piece. Each time, again, they stated what I just mentioned to you. They reiterated that it makes it easier and they can do it with what you have. And they really had a hard time bridging the operational definition between a spark and a spark trigger. It just didn't really relate to them. Even though we talk about motivation, we talk about pleasure, pain, and the different aspects, it was hard for them to operationalize that from what it's being told to what the actual message was. So again, keeping it simple, keeping it as not vague, but just not specific, making sure that it's a true motivation piece. So what we're doing in the process right now is we plan to send the revised Spark and Facilitator survey to new participants. So we're done with these 8 people that have cycled through. We're actually going to send the survey out to fresh set of minds that have not been involved. So we're going to send it out to 20 individuals and see what the responses are going to be. We anticipate, just like with the second rendition, that our scores are going to increase. We hope that they're going to increase with the new methodologies that we put in place in trying to design these different types of triggers. Okay. So in conclusion, designing triggers to influence motivation or ability seems easy on the surface. I can attest to that, but it wasn't. But does require thorough understanding, number one, of your topic, behavior change, what you're trying to ultimately change, human interpretation and semantics, and then extensive user testing. one of the items that we really, or I did not foresee, was the difference in one's interpretation of these different statements. We really thought because we were working off of an existing model and we were utilizing tested information coming out of the American Diabetic Association that we really could design these triggers and we would have a pretty consensus understanding as to, hey, this is motivating us, this is something that we are trying to just improve our ability to actually do something. And it turned out that that's not the case whatsoever. And so hindsight is, as we're looking through this literature, I can understand why there's not a ton of research that has happened with stacking these two. Because as with the reminder, we could have set these reminder messages up in a day or two, and we could have done some research, and we would have been done. In this case, we're really having to spend quite a bit of time on this, and we have a predefined population that we're working with, information that's coming from the American Diabetic Association. If we wanted to potentially throw this out to a group like yourselves that are dynamic across the board, we'd have to really think about from a different construct of how we're going to design these messages, because we're not focused around a central theme that one can identify as motivation or ability. And so because we're working at a population level with a subset that's identified, we think that the changes that we have been making will continue to carry over into this third rendition, where we should receive a much higher response rate of identifying what's a motivator and also what's a facilitator. Okay. All right. Well, I walked through that probably a little quicker than I anticipated. With that, that's the conclusion of the study. I was really actually hoping to present this in about a month and a half, where we would have had all the data and we would have been able to show it up, but ended up having to go a little early. Good news is I'm going to present again in the spring, for which we'll have all this data, and we'll have data coming out of the mHealth application, as that's currently being designed as well. So hopefully at that time we'll have all the data for you to visualize what has been pre and post. One of the things that I didn't talk about is what we're trying to really improve here with these triggers are outcomes that we're looking at. In our initial plan, we were going to look at a lot of outcomes data coming out of clinical databases and coming out of claims databases. Now we're going to primarily focus on their self-efficacy and their self-care measures. So all of these triggers have been designed around that. And the way the application is working, or is going to work, is we're running it for 3 months. It's going to focus on 3 different aspects. The first one will be diet. The second one will be exercise. The third one will be a combination of glucose adherence, preventative measures, outside factors, etc. Within each one of those modules, as you can see, I talked about carbohydrates. Anybody, if you remember, I talked about some carbohydrates there. Well, week 1 of their diet module is all about carbohydrates. So they're going to get these messages specific to what we're covering each week. So the next week is going to be about desserts. Well, that's where that recipe came into play. So we're keeping these contextual flowing through what they're going to be doing all the time. So again, where we talked about these messages has to be defined, understood, and the timing is important. We have our proper sequencing, so we're not sending them messages about recipes to eat a pie when we're talking about carbohydrates. We don't want to do any of that. Again, we're going to have a low retention rate within our mHealth application. So, all right, any questions?
How are you going to vary the messages? How are you going to stack it against? I guess maybe I'm just misunderstanding.
Yeah. So the way we're rolling it out. So within the mHealth application, again, we're going to have 99 individuals. We'll have a control group, and then we'll have 33 receive Spark messages, 33 receive Facilitator messages. What everyone is going to receive within the mHealth application is a simple layout into the mHealth application where everyone will roll into these different modules every week, and there will be resources, okay? Everyone will have access to that, including the control group. What the Spark group and what the Facilitator group are going to receive in addition to all of that is these different types of trigger messages that we're going to send to them. And so with that being said, a lot of the resources that are available to them are going to be talked about in these different type of triggers. And so one of the things that we're looking at from an effectiveness standpoint is if everyone has access to this vanilla version of this mHealth application, including the control group, when we stack these triggers up against each other and then the control group, as we reiterate this information via the triggers, do we see an increase in these specific types of individuals going now and access these resources versus the control group and then versus maybe the other group? So what we may find out is when it comes to carbohydrate intakes, for whatever reason, we have individuals that lack motivation utilize those resources more than people with high ability, or with the people that are in the control group that are receiving none of these studies, or vice versa. And so when we're talking about stacking, at least in my definition, that's what I'm talking about from the stacking component.
So they all get the same pre-post measures
Yes.
of efficacy, knowledge, and other things, that it's an aggregate across each of the potential triggers to look for the greatest gains, whether or not the triggers themselves have a differential effect, without controlling for motivation prior to enrollment. So he could have measured motivation and then said, okay, if you're motivated, you get this kind of thing. But it's really hard to measure motivation.
No. And and again, I'm working with this particular hospital system, and one of their big things that they're pushing, and we're trying to keep that in balance with the research, is they're really struggling with population health just like with everyone else. And so they're really looking at methodologies to bring in research methodologies that are grounded in theory so that they can roll out to their populations to try to better manage their population health. They're a hospital system that's bought, I think they're now up to 8 hospitals. And so not only do they have their ACO model with their patients, they also have a large, robust amount of employees where they're self-insured. And so they see their skyrocketing costs as well. So they're really wanting to look at this, how can we target these population groups? And the number one spender within their system just happens to be diabetes, and that's why we're working on that.
Because it may be the case that while most people in here are selecting number 2 of liking the lens of you can do it, that may not actually have the most impact on behavior.
Correct.
I want to make sure I understand how you capture the impact of the trigger on the participants, and if I don't understand it, would really help me understand it. Are you capturing them by their behavior when they go to use those resources that you're recommending?
That's going to be one. What they're also doing is, ahead of the study, everyone is going to do a self-efficacy questionnaire. We're going to understand that. They're also going to do a self-care measure. They're also going to answer some knowledge questions. What's going to happen is, as they're rotating through the different modules, every week they're actually going to be answering different types of knowledge questions. And then at the end, they're actually going to be answering, and they're going to redo the post self-efficacy and self-care measures as well. And so we're going to have all that data. Then we're going to have the intermittent data of usage within the tool itself. And so I'm pretty sure we're going to have.
You're going to measure the change based on the messages that were sent, the triggers that were sent out.
Still looking at it at that level. We're really looking at it more of as a whole unit. So the Spark group and then the Facilitator group, what we will be able to do is tease apart these individual messages, because there will be things that will show up that we can identify within these individual messages, like I talked about earlier, where it may be within this particular module in this particular week that this group did better on accessing these different types of applications than others. Then what else is built in there is at the end of every week, they answer 2 knowledge questions and a self-efficacy questions. And so that will continue to roll over time as well. And so we'll be able to identify that as well. And what's going to happen, most probably, one of the things that we think about is that we're going to see an up and down. Some people are going to have a better understanding, especially self-efficacy wise. Some people may believe that they can better manage their diet than their exercise, or vice versa. And so one of the other things that we're doing is we're actually not going to roll the very first piece of the tool out until January. So we're not rolling this out, even though I would have loved to roll it out ahead of time, but we're not rolling it out during the holiday season or anything along those lines, because that could bring in its own set of challenges, especially where I live in Louisiana, where, everybody eats.
More slightly motivated people with the New Year's, I can do it, sort
Yes.
of thing. But far better than the, I'm giving up on your tool, because
Yes.
it's Thanksgiving.
That's Thanksgiving, yeah. So, all right. The only thing I'll have to worry about with Mardi Gras a little bit later is all the king cake stuff, but we're doing diet first, so we'll be good. Any other questions?
Do you make a distinction between a trigger and an alert?
In the literature that you'll read, basically, a lot of people, it's kind of, again, semantics. Everybody uses these different terminologies the same way. A lot of people will just say, a lot of times when you read the literature, when you see trigger, it's basically an alert. But when you start to read the literature that really dives into the behavior change components, triggers really become more of call to actions or cues. So it's more than just an alert. So the way I keep it in my head, and the way I want to interpret it as, an alert is a signal in this case. It's just a simple reminder. It's an alert or a reminder to do something. In these other cases, it's bringing in aspects of behavior change, and where you're really focused on motivation, ability, and different things like that. It really depends what literature you read.
Yeah, but if you're developing a clinical application that has legal ramifications for the recipient to act on that information, how would you differentiate the two?
I would go to my hospital attorney first and figure out what.
Well,
What.
because for the hospital system, you're not trying to impact behavior change necessarily, so the alerts might be more based on content of an information push for decision support, rather than he's trying to impact behavior. So unless you were building a system that said, you really should go document now.
Well, no, but you raised a good question, because documentation is that ugly, it's very punitive. You know, you're going to lose your privileges if you don't update your electronic medical record because JACO's coming. So how would you conceptualize maybe a trigger that'll make the experience actually pleasurable for the clinician who's going to be affected by the mandates?
It would be interesting to think that we could have systems that could rally you by saying, you're 80% done with this report, it'll take X amount of time to finish it out. It's hard to imagine that we would have systems that could be allowed to coach, particularly if the responses are then also tracked to say, well, you were told and didn't do it. It's sort of like looking at how often alerts are turned off or ignored. The legal ramifications of that are very different for the hospital setting versus a behavior change.
And it's funny you say that, because all what we're talking about now is just we're moving into an electronic age. But when I was an undergraduate and I had to do interns in medical record departments back when they were still called that, in order to get our physicians in there to complete their charts, or the medical records director at the time actually created like a wheel of fortune. And every time they walked in, they got to spin the wheel, and they got a prize for coming into incomplete charts and completing their charts. And so, it's something that's been used for a long time, just not in the electronic, environment. So again, not that that was a way to sustain behavior change. It was just an immediate gratification of, hey, I walk in here, I get something. But it just goes to show you, it's things that have been done already back on paper when trying to encourage people to do something.
It's an interesting idea. It's like having your Fitbit vibrate to say, get up and walk around. It's just a question of, could we ever build that into those kinds of tools, or are they always going to have to be external reminders? They now have sensor-based technology that will remind you of your mood and say, based on this, your breathing's changed and you're looking a little stressed, get up and walk around and see if that helps. Maybe we will have external reminders that say, I think you've forgotten something.
And the only other thing I want to point out, because a lot of times when I'm talking about this, because I mentioned that all these are employed people within the hospital, and they're RNs, they're clerical, et cetera. And in the very beginning, people questioned, and I did as well until we did an initial focus group, that these people would be such an anomaly compared to everybody else, but it actually wasn't. When we started to do the focus group sessions with them, basically they're almost no different than what the original diabetic population is, and they struggle with the same things of people bringing in, those little bundt cakes, every day if they're working at one of the physician's office, and how do they not eat this little bundt cake with all the frosting on it? And so they're dealing with the same issues as everyone else. And we had people stating how they couldn't manage their diabetes. We had RNs stating that they had all the motivation and ability in the world, and those are the people that were actually probably just needed the signal, the reminder to check your blood glucose, stop doing what you're doing, take a break and manage yourself. So they're really a somewhat interesting population, because I thought they would be more of an anomaly than what they are. All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you. And hopefully in the spring we'll have tons of data that we'll be able to show up and not have as much language. Thanks.